Black boy told to wait outside, gate area. Minutes later, the pilot steps out and calls him son. The fluorescent lights of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport cast harsh shadows across Marcus Washington's face as he stood rigidly outside the gate area, his permission slip clutched so tightly in his hand that the edges had begun to crumple. 14 years of his father's careful instructions echoed in his mind. Stay calm. Be respectful. Don't make a scene. But the humiliation burning in his chest made his breath catch. Just 20 feet away, behind the frosted glass partition where the gate agent had directed him to wait, other students from Westlake High were already seated, laughing, preparing for their career day interviews. Only Marcus stood outside, separated, his crisp blue button-down shirt and carefully pressed khakis now feeling like an inadequate armor against the stares of passing travelers. "It's just a misunderstanding," he whispered to himself, though the words felt hollow. The gate agent, her platinum blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, her lips pursed as she'd scanned his documentation, had been clear. "You'll need to wait outside the secured area until your interviewer can validate your access." Her pause had been slight but unmistakable, her eyes flicking from his permission slip to his face with the briefest hesitation. Marcus had seen that look before, the subtle calculation, the recalibration of expectations. His father called it the adjustment, that moment when people realized their assumptions and reality didn't align. Time stretched interminably as Marcus watched a family walk past, the father's hand protectively on his daughter's shoulder. The man caught Marcus's eye, then quickly looked away, pulling his daughter slightly closer. Marcus swallowed hard and checked his watch. His interview with Captain Robert Mitchell was scheduled to begin in 8 minutes. Would the captain even look for him if he wasn't in the designated area? Would this opportunity, one Marcus had worked months to secure for his future aviation career project, simply evaporate because of whatever verification the gate agent deemed necessary? The airport announcements droned overhead, a symphony of departures and arrivals punctuated by security reminders. Marcus shifted his weight from one foot to the other, consciously trying to appear non-threatening, smaller somehow. Another habit his father had never explicitly taught, but that Marcus had absorbed through years of watching James Washington navigate predominantly white spaces. When the glass door to the gate area suddenly swung open, Marcus straightened, hope flaring briefly before being tempered by caution. But what emerged from the doorway was neither the dismissive gate agent nor airport security. It was a tall, broad-shouldered man in the crisp uniform of Delta Airlines, captain's stripes gleaming on his shoulders, his salt and pepper hair cropped close to his head. His face, lined with the wisdom of decades in the sky, broke into a warm smile that transformed his serious demeanor. "You must be Marcus Washington," the captain said, his voice carrying a resonant authority that turned heads throughout the concourse. Without hesitation, he extended his hand. "I'm Captain Robert Mitchell. I've been looking forward to meeting you, son." The word son hung in the air between them, casual yet profound. Marcus saw the gate agent's head snap up from her computer, her eyes widening slightly. Nearby passengers slowed, curious about the pilot's presence outside the secure area. Marcus heard a woman whisper something to her companion, too quiet to discern except for the surprise in her tone. As Marcus reached out to shake the captain's hand, he noticed how firm and steady it felt, like the man himself, reliable, secure. "Yes, sir, thank you for meeting with me." Captain Mitchell's eyes narrowed slightly as he glanced toward the gate area where the other students sat. "Why are you waiting out here? Your classmates are already settled in our conference room." Before Marcus could formulate a response that wouldn't sound accusatory, the captain turned toward the gate agent, his expression maintaining its professional warmth though his eyes had hardened almost imperceptibly. "Ms. Winters, there seems to be some confusion. Mr. Washington here is part of the Westlake High Career Shadow Program. He has all the proper documentation." The gate agent, Ms. Winters, flushed slightly. "I was just following protocol, Captain. His paperwork seemed different from the others." "Different?" Captain Mitchell raised an eyebrow, his tone still pleasant, but now carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I've personally approved all the students' documentation. Perhaps you could clarify what seemed different about Mr. Washington's paperwork." The concourse seemed to grow quieter, as if the ambient noise of the airport had been dialed down to better hear this exchange. Marcus felt simultaneously invisible and exposed, a contradiction he'd experienced many times before. Ms. Winter's fingers fluttered nervously over her keyboard. There was just, I needed to verify, it's the procedure for. I believe we can sort this out quickly, Captain Mitchell interrupted smoothly, placing a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. Mr. Washington has an appointment with me, and I make it a point never to keep the future of aviation waiting. He turned to Marcus with a conspiratorial wink. What do you say we get started? I've got about 45 minutes before pre-flight checks, and I hear you've got some serious questions about aerodynamics. The weight of the captain's hand on his shoulder felt like an anchor grounding Marcus after the disorienting experience at the gate. Yes, sir. I've been researching laminar airflow and its effects on fuel efficiency. Captain Mitchell's genuine laugh caught Marcus by surprise. Laminar airflow, huh? Most kids want to know about emergencies and barrel rolls. He guided Marcus toward the gate entrance. Ms. Winters, I'll take responsibility for Mr. Washington from here. As they passed through the gate, Marcus felt Ms. Winters' eyes following them. He kept his gaze forward, chin slightly raised, another of his father's silent lessons. I apologize for the confusion, Captain Mitchell said quietly once they were past the security checkpoint. These career days are usually smoother. It's okay, Marcus replied automatically, the response practiced and polished through years of similar situations. I'm used to it. The captain stopped walking, turning to face Marcus fully. Around them, the airport continued its choreographed chaos, passengers rushing to make connections, announcements echoing through the terminal. But in that moment, it felt as if they stood in a bubble of stillness. No, Captain Mitchell said, his voice gentle but firm. It's not okay, and you shouldn't be used to it. He studied Marcus's face with an intensity that was somehow not uncomfortable. You know, you remind me of someone. Before Marcus could ask who, they were interrupted by a flight attendant hurrying toward them with a tablet in hand. Captain Mitchell, there's a situation with the manifest for Flight 1382, she said, slightly breathless. I'll be right there, Sarah, he responded, never taking his eyes off Marcus. Why don't you head into the conference room with the other students? I need 2 minutes to address this, and then we'll begin. As Marcus pushed open the door to the small conference room where 5 other students sat around a polished table, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter with Captain Mitchell was significant beyond the context of a school project. Something in the captain's eyes when he'd said, "You remind me of someone," had sparked a curiosity that quickly overshadowed the incident at the gate. Little did Marcus know that what had begun as a routine career day interview would unearth long-buried connections that would forever alter his understanding of his family's past and his own future. The next hour would reveal how deeply intertwined his life was with Captain Robert Mitchell's, a connection forged decades ago in circumstances that neither his father nor the captain had ever expected to revisit. James Washington checked his watch for the 3rd time in 5 minutes, his dark fingers drumming an anxious rhythm against the steering wheel of his 10-year-old Honda Accord. The digital clock on the dashboard read 3:42 p.m., still 18 minutes before Marcus's career day interview was scheduled to end. But James had left work early, unable to concentrate on architectural drawings while his son was at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport alone. Not alone, James corrected himself aloud in the empty car, with his classmates and teachers. But the distinction provided little comfort. Airport security had always made James uneasy, even before he became responsible for raising a black son in America. His phone buzzed with a text message. Expecting it to be from Marcus, James was surprised to see his sister Aisha's name on the screen instead. How's our little aviator doing? Get any insider pilot secrets yet? James smiled despite his anxiety. Aisha had been Marcus's most enthusiastic supporter when he'd announced his intention to become a pilot, gifting him flight simulator software and aviation books for every birthday and Christmas since he was 10. Interview still in progress, James typed back. Waiting in the cell phone lot. Will update you when I pick him up. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and tried to focus on the positives. This opportunity was significant for Marcus. A one-on-one interview with a senior commercial pilot as part of his career exploration project. James had been impressed when Marcus showed him the confirmation email from Delta Airlines, though a flicker of concern had immediately followed his initial pride. His son would be navigating spaces that weren't always welcoming, interacting with people who might carry unconscious biases. James had spent the past 14 years preparing Marcus for these realities, while trying desperately not to extinguish the boy's natural optimism. James's mind wandered back to his own father, Walter Washington, who had served as one of the few black aircraft mechanics in the Air Force during the Vietnam era. Walter had dreamed of flying, but had been steered toward mechanics instead. More appropriate, he'd been told. Those dreams had transferred to James, who'd taken flying lessons during college before financial reality had redirected him toward architecture. Now, the aspiration had found new life in Marcus, the third generation of Washington men to look skyward with longing. The buzzing of his phone jolted James from his reflections. This time, it was Marcus calling. "Hey, son, everything okay?" James tried to keep his tone casual, though tension threaded through the question. "Dad," Marcus's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding strangely urgent. "You need to come inside." James sat up straighter, instantly alert. "What happened? Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Marcus assured him quickly. "Better than fine, but—" He paused, and James could hear background noise, announcements, the murmur of conversations. "There's someone you need to meet. Captain Mitchell, the pilot I'm interviewing. He—" Another pause. "He knows you, Dad, or at least I think he does. He keeps asking questions about Grandpa Walter and about Mom." James felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "What kind of questions?" "He asked if I was related to Walter Washington, who worked at Dobbins Air Reserve Base in the 70s. And when I mentioned Mom's name, he got this look on his face. Dad, I think he knew her." The cold weight in James's stomach transformed into a block of ice. Jessica. Marcus's mother had been gone for 12 years now, but the mention of her name in this unexpected context made it feel as if she'd just left yesterday. James closed his eyes briefly, seeing her face as vividly as ever. Her warm brown eyes, the constellation of freckles across her nose, the smile that had first captivated him in their college physics class. "Dad, are you there?" "I'm here," James said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Where exactly are you?" "Concourse E near gate E16. The interview is running long. Captain Mitchell asked if he could meet you." James checked his watch again. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't—" He hesitated, unsure what warning or instruction to give. "I'm on my way." As James navigated the short-term parking garage, his mind raced through possibilities. Robert Mitchell. The name wasn't immediately familiar, but Jessica had known many people through her work as a flight attendant before Marcus was born, before the diagnosis that had changed everything. Had Mitchell been a colleague, a friend, something more? James pushed the last thought away as he hurried through the terminal, following signs toward Concourse E. Jessica had been gone a long time, and Marcus needed this opportunity. Whatever connection existed between Captain Mitchell and their family's past, James would handle it with the same careful calculation he brought to everything involving his son's well-being. When James reached gate E16, he immediately spotted Marcus sitting in the waiting area, engaged in animated conversation with a uniformed pilot whose back was to James. His son's face was lit with an excitement James hadn't seen in months, perhaps years, the unguarded enthusiasm of childhood that had gradually been tempered by adolescence and awareness. As if sensing his father's presence, Marcus looked up, his eyes finding James instantly. "Dad," he called, waving James over. The pilot turned, and James felt the world tilt slightly beneath his feet. The man was older now, his once auburn hair now gray at the temples, lines etched around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But James recognized him immediately, not from Jessica's life, but from his own. "James Washington," the pilot said, standing and extending his hand. His voice carried the same assured authority that James remembered from that night 30 years ago. "It's been a long time." "Captain Mitchell," James replied, taking the offered hand automatically while his mind struggled to reconcile past and present. This was the man who had changed the trajectory of James's life in a single rain-soaked evening in 1994. And now, by some cosmic coincidence, or fate, as Jessica would have called it, he was sitting with Marcus, talking about aviation and futures. Marcus looked between the two men, his expression shifting from excitement to confusion. "You do know each other?" "We've met," James said carefully, releasing Mitchell's hand. Once a long time ago. Captain Mitchell's steady gaze held James's, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Your son is remarkably knowledgeable about aviation, James. He tells me he wants to become a commercial pilot. Since he was old enough to recognize an airplane in the sky, James confirmed, placing a protective hand on Marcus's shoulder. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, his perceptiveness, another quality inherited from Jessica, catching the undercurrent of tension. How do you know each other? You never mentioned knowing a pilot, Dad. Before James could formulate a response, an announcement came over the PA system. Final boarding call for Delta Flight 1382 to Boston, now boarding at Gate E16. Captain Mitchell glanced at his watch. That's my flight. He turned to Marcus with genuine regret in his expression. I need to go, but I'd like to continue our conversation. Perhaps, he hesitated, looking to James with an unspoken question. James found himself nodding before he'd consciously decided to do so. We can arrange something. Relief flashed across Mitchell's face. Good, that's good. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a business card, handing it to Marcus. My personal number is on the back. Call me in a few days and we'll set up a time to continue your interview. Maybe a tour of the flight simulator facility if you're interested. Marcus's eyes widened. The full-motion simulators, seriously. Mitchell smiled, a genuine warmth transforming his serious features. Absolutely. You've got the makings of an excellent pilot, Marcus. I'd be proud to help you along that path. He checked his watch again and grimaced. I really have to go. It was a pleasure meeting you, son. There it was again. That word, son, spoken with such natural ease. James felt an irrational surge of something between protectiveness and jealousy as he watched Mitchell shake Marcus's hand, then hurry toward the jetway where the flight attendant was waiting with barely concealed impatience. As the door to the jetway closed behind Captain Mitchell, Marcus turned to James, his expression a mixture of excitement and suspicion. Dad, what's going on? How do you know Captain Mitchell? And why did he ask about Grandpa Walter and Mom? James sighed, suddenly feeling the weight of secrets and histories he'd never intended to share with Marcus, at least not yet. It's complicated, Marcus. That's what adults always say when they don't want to explain something, Marcus replied, an edge creeping into his voice. I'm not a little kid anymore, Dad. Looking at his son, tall for 14, with Jessica's intelligent eyes and determined chin, James had to acknowledge the truth of that statement. Marcus wasn't a child anymore, and perhaps it was time for him to know the full story of his family's connection to the Sky All, the dreams achieved, deferred, and broken across 3 generations of Washington men. You're right, James conceded. Let's find somewhere to sit and I'll tell you about the night I met Robert Mitchell. But first, he gestured toward the gate area. What happened when you arrived? You were outside the secure area when I called earlier. Marcus's expression clouded briefly. The gate agent said there was something different about my documentation, made me wait outside while she verified it. He made air quotes around the word. But then Captain Mitchell came out and called me son right in front of everyone. You should have seen the gate agent's face. James felt the familiar mix of anger and resignation that accompanied these stories, stories that had become more frequent as Marcus grew older. And then he brought me inside, and we had the best conversation about aviation, Dad. He knows everything, not just about flying, but about the business side, the engineering, the history. Marcus's eyes shone with renewed enthusiasm. He said I asked better questions than most first-year flight students, and when I mentioned Grandpa Walter working at Dobbins, he got this strange look on his face and started asking about our family. James nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. Let's find a coffee shop. This might take a while. As they walked through the bustling terminal, James noticed how other travelers reacted to them. The subtle shifts in posture, the quick assessments, the occasional friendly smile or averted gaze. He wondered if Marcus noticed too, or if his son's mind was too full of airplanes and future possibilities to register these micro-expressions that James had been reading his entire life. They found a quiet table at an airport cafe, and James took a deep breath, preparing to share a story he'd kept buried for 3 decades. A story about a young black man with dreams of flight, a white pilot who appeared on a rainy Georgia night, and a moment of both tragedy and possibility that had altered the course of multiple lives. "It started with your grandfather's funeral," James began softly. "April 1994, I was 19 years old, home from my first year at Georgia Tech." Marcus leaned forward, his hands wrapped around a cup of hot chocolate that had long since gone cold, as his father's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. Around them, the airport cafe hummed with the white noise of traveler conversations, clinking cups, and occasional announcements. But Marcus was entirely focused on his father's words, on the story unfolding before him, a story that somehow belonged to him too, though he was learning it for the first time. "The rain was coming down so hard I could barely see the road," James continued, his gaze distant as if looking through the years to that night. "I was driving your grandfather's old Buick, the car he'd promised would be mine when I got my license, though he never lived to see that day. The windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the downpour, and I should have pulled over, but I was angry. So angry at everything, at God for taking my father, at the Air Force for the ceremony that felt so impersonal, at myself for not being there when he had the heart attack." James paused, taking a sip of his coffee before continuing. "I was on Old Highway 41 near where it crosses the Chattahoochee. There's a sharp curve there, and I took it too fast. The Buick hydroplaned, and suddenly I was spinning across the center line. I remember seeing headlights coming toward me, bright through the rain, and thinking, this is it. I'm going to see Dad again sooner than I expected." Marcus swallowed hard, imagining his 19-year-old father in that moment, alone, grieving, facing what seemed like certain disaster. It was difficult to reconcile that image with the steady, controlled man who sat across from him now, the father who checked smoke detector batteries monthly and insisted on text message updates whenever Marcus went anywhere. "But the crash never came," James said. "The other driver somehow managed to swerve onto the shoulder. My car spun completely around and stalled in the middle of the road. I sat there, hands frozen on the wheel, heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe." James's fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the cafe table. "That's when he appeared at my window, Captain Robert Mitchell, though I didn't know his name then. He was in civilian clothes, but he had that military bearing that reminded me of your grandfather. He helped me move the Buick off the road, checked to make sure I wasn't injured, and then insisted on driving me home because I was clearly in no state to be behind the wheel." "Where are you watching from right now? If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel and leaving a comment below. Your support helps us create more content like this. Now, back to James and Marcus's conversation at the airport cafe. "During that drive," James continued, "we talked, really talked in the way strangers sometimes can. I told him about my father's funeral that day, about how Walter Washington had served as an aircraft mechanic in Vietnam, about how he'd wanted to be a pilot but had been steered toward mechanics instead. I told him about my own flying lessons that I could barely afford, about my dream of finishing what my father had started." Marcus nodded, pieces beginning to connect in his mind. "That's why you recognized Captain Mitchell right away." "Yes, but there's more to it." James leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Mitchell told me he was a pilot with Delta, that he'd started in the Air Force. Turned out he'd been stationed at Dobbins for a while and had actually known your grandfather. Walter had worked on Mitchell's training aircraft several times. Small world, right?" "That's why he asked about Grandpa Walter," Marcus murmured. "Exactly. But what really shocked me was when he asked if I wanted to continue my flight training. When I explained that college tuition was already stretching my resources to the breaking point, he offered to help. Said he could arrange discounted lessons through some connections he had, maybe even assist with finding scholarships." Marcus's eyebrows shot up. "Did you take him up on it?" A flash of something, regret, resentment, crossed James's face. "I thought about it. We exchanged information. I was supposed to call him the following week." "But you didn't," Marcus guessed when his father fell silent. James shook his head slowly. 3 days after I met Mitchell, I got a call from Georgia Tech. There had been a fire in my dormitory. Nothing of mine was damaged, but they needed me to come back to campus immediately to sort out housing reassignments. Between that chaos and my grief over your grandfather, I put Mitchell's number aside. Weeks passed, then months. By the time I thought about calling him again, it felt too awkward, too much time had gone by. "So that's why you never finished your flight training," Marcus said, a sudden understanding dawning. He'd always known his father had once taken flying lessons, had always wondered why that dream had been abandoned. You could have been a pilot. Maybe. James looked directly at his son, his expression softening. But then my life took a different turn. I met your mother the following semester in physics class, changed my major from aerospace engineering to architecture, started building a different kind of future. And now Captain Mitchell shows up in my life, talking about flight simulators and aviation careers, Marcus said, wonder creeping into his voice. It's like the universe is giving our family another chance at the sky. James smiled, though there was a complicated emotion behind it that Marcus couldn't quite identify. Your mother would have said exactly that. She believed in signs and circular patterns, the way life sometimes loops back on itself to offer second chances. A comfortable silence fell between them, each lost in their own thoughts as the ambient noise of the airport washed over them. Marcus turned Captain Mitchell's business card over in his hand, reading the handwritten phone number on the back. There's something I still don't understand, he finally said. Why did he ask about Mom? Did he know her too? James's expression shifted subtly, a shadow passing over his features. No, not directly, but there's another part to this story, Marcus, something I haven't told anyone in a very long time. The serious tone in his father's voice made Marcus sit up straighter, tension coiling in his stomach. What is it? That night after Mitchell dropped me at my mother's house, he gave me his card. As he was leaving, he said something I've never forgotten. He said, "Your father saved my life once, did you know that?" Marcus leaned forward. Grandpa Walter saved Captain Mitchell's life. How? Mitchell was preparing for a training flight at Dobbins. Your grandfather was doing the pre-flight check and discovered a critical fault in the fuel line, something that would have likely resulted in a catastrophic failure midair. Because Walter Washington was so thorough, so skilled at his job, Robert Mitchell walked away that day. Flew many more days after that. Wow, Marcus breathed, a surge of pride warming his chest. Grandpa was a hero. He was, James agreed. Though he never saw it that way, to him it was just doing his job right, but Mitchell never forgot. He told me he'd always wanted to thank my father properly, but never got the chance. The next time he returned to Dobbins, Walter had been transferred to another base. Marcus nodded slowly, processing this information. So when he saw my last name today and I mentioned Grandpa Walter, he must have put it together, realized you were Walter Washington's grandson. But that still doesn't explain why he asked about Mom. James's hands tightened around his coffee cup. The night I met Mitchell, the night he drove me home in the rain, he said something else. He said life has a way of creating debts that need to be repaid, and that because he couldn't thank my father, he wanted to help me instead. He called it passing it forward. James paused, his voice growing softer. When your mother got sick, when the medical bills started piling up, I thought about contacting him. I even found his card, still in my old wallet. But what, Dad? But my pride got in the way, James admitted, the words seeming to cost him something. The idea of asking for help from a virtual stranger, of admitting I couldn't handle things on my own, I couldn't do it. By the time I was desperate enough to consider it, your mother was. He stopped, swallowing hard. It was too late. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. The loss of his mother when he was just 2 years old had shaped his life in ways he was still discovering, but he'd never before considered how her illness and death had forced his father to make impossible choices. So when you saw Captain Mitchell today, Marcus began, I recognized the man who once offered help that I was too proud to accept, James finished quietly. The man who might have changed our family's story if I'd made a different choice. Marcus turned the business card over again in his hand, the weight of history, both lived and unlived, suddenly heavy in the small rectangle of cardstock. And now he's offering to help me become a pilot. James reached across the table, placing his hand over his son's. Life really does move in circles, just like your mother always said. A new voice broke into their conversation, a woman's voice, crisp and professional. Excuse me, Mr. Washington. Both James and Marcus looked up to see the gate agent from earlier, Ms. Winters, standing beside their table, her posture rigid but her expression uncertain. Yes, James responded cautiously. I wanted to apologize to your son, she said, glancing at Marcus. There was a misunderstanding earlier regarding his documentation for the Career Day program. Captain Mitchell has clarified the situation, and I want to assure you it won't happen again." Marcus exchanged a quick look with his father, reading the silent message in James's eyes. "Be gracious, even when it's difficult." "Thank you," Marcus said simply. Ms. Winters lingered for a moment as if wanting to say more, then nodded and walked away, her shoulders slightly less rigid than before. "That was unexpected," James remarked once she was out of earshot. "Captain Mitchell must have said something to her," Marcus speculated, "before he boarded his flight." James checked his watch. "Speaking of which, Flight 1382 should be in the air by now. Boston," he said. Marcus nodded, then hesitated before asking the question that had been forming in his mind throughout their conversation. "Dad, are you okay with me staying in touch with Captain Mitchell, learning from him?" James was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a certainty that reassured Marcus. "Yes, I think your grandfather would have wanted that, your mother too." "And you," Marcus pressed. James smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I want you to have every opportunity I didn't take, every door I was afraid to walk through. If Robert Mitchell can help you achieve your dreams of flying, then yes, I'm more than okay with it." Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a tension he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. "Thanks, Dad." As they gathered their things to leave the airport, Marcus's phone chimed with a text message notification. He glanced at the screen, then stopped abruptly, staring at the message from an unknown number. "What is it?" James asked. "It's from Captain Mitchell," Marcus said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "He must have gotten my number from the interview registration form." "What does it say?" Marcus read the message aloud. "Marcus forgot to mention, if you're interested in aviation history, I have some materials that belong to your grandfather, Mitchell." James's eyebrows shot up. "Materials that belong to Dad? What is he talking about?" "I don't know," Marcus replied, quickly typing a response. "What kind of materials?" The reply came almost immediately, his flight log from when he briefly trained as a pilot before being reassigned to mechanics. Also some technical notebooks. "Found them when cleaning out an old office at Dobbins years ago. Recognized the name. Been meaning to return them to your family but lost track. We'll bring them to our next meeting." Marcus showed the message to his father, watching as James's expression cycled through shock, confusion, and finally, a sort of wondering amazement. "Dad trained as a pilot?" James murmured, more to himself than to Marcus. "He never told me that." "Maybe he didn't want you to know about another dream deferred," Marcus suggested quietly. James looked at his son with new eyes, struck by the insight that seemed beyond Marcus's 14 years. "When did you get so wise?" "Must be those Washington genes," Marcus replied with a small smile. As they walked through the terminal toward the parking garage, Marcus found himself looking up at the massive windows that lined the concourse, watching as a Delta jetliner climbed into the late afternoon sky. Perhaps Captain Mitchell's flight to Boston. 3 generations of Washington men had looked up at ascending aircraft with longing, each coming a little closer to the dream of flight without quite grasping it fully. But perhaps the 4th time was the charm. Perhaps Marcus Washington would finally complete the journey his great-grandfather had begun. What neither Marcus nor James could know as they drove home that evening, discussing flight simulators and aviation careers with new enthusiasm, was how deeply their lives would become intertwined with Robert Mitchell's over the coming months, or how the full story of their family's connection was far more complex than a chance encounter on a rainy night in 1994. The truth, when it emerged, would challenge everything James thought he knew about his father, about Jessica, and about the seemingly random intersections of lives that Jessica had always insisted were anything but random. But that revelation was still to come. For now, as the Washington men headed home with renewed purpose, the sky above them glowed with the promise of possibilities neither had dared to imagine that morning. 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in the Delta Flight Simulator facility, his heart racing with a mixture of nervousness and exhilaration as Captain Mitchell guided him through the pre-flight checklist. The simulator, a perfect replica of the Boeing 737 cockpit Mitchell typically flew, hummed with technological promise, its array of instruments and controls both intimidating and enticing. "Always start with the external power switch," Mitchell instructed, pointing to a control on the overhead panel. "Then move systematically through each system." Marcus nodded, absorbing the information with the focused attention he'd brought to their meetings over the past weeks. Since that first encounter at the airport, Captain Mitchell had become a steady presence in his life, scheduling regular mentoring sessions, arranging tour of maintenance facilities, even helping Marcus prepare for the aviation science competition at school. James had been surprised but supportive when Mitchell had called 2 days after their airport encounter, proposing a structured mentorship program for Marcus. "It's something I do occasionally for promising students," Mitchell had explained. "Usually through formal channels, but sometimes there are connections that seem destined." That word, destined, had raised James's eyebrows, reminding him so strongly of Jessica's belief in cosmic patterns that he'd agreed more readily than he might have otherwise. And so the arrangement had begun, with Mitchell dedicating his free time between flights to nurturing Marcus's aviation aspirations. Now, as Marcus carefully toggled switches under Mitchell's watchful eye, the captain nodded with approval. "You have good hands, Marcus, steady, methodical, essential qualities for a pilot." "My dad says I get that from my mom," Marcus replied, concentrating on the altimeter settings. "She was always precise about everything." A flicker of something, curiosity, hesitation, crossed Mitchell's face. It wasn't the first time Marcus had noticed this reaction when he mentioned his mother. Though Mitchell and James had settled into a cordial, if somewhat reserved relationship, there remained an undercurrent of unspoken history between them that Marcus couldn't quite decipher. "Your father mentioned she was a flight attendant," Mitchell said carefully. "For a few years before I was born," Marcus confirmed. "Delta actually, like you, that's partly why I've always been interested in aviation. Mom's stories, Grandpa Walter's Air Force background, Dad's brief time taking flying lessons. It's in my blood, I guess." Mitchell's hand paused over the instrument panel. "Your father told you about his flying lessons?" "After we met you at the airport," Marcus said, looking up from the controls. "He told me about the night you nearly crashed into each other during a rainstorm, about how you drove him home and offered to help with his training." He hesitated before adding, "He told me he never called you, and he's always wondered how things might have been different if he had." Mitchell was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Life rarely moves in straight lines, Marcus. Sometimes the detours lead us exactly where we need to be, even if it's not where we thought we were heading." "That sounds like something my mom would say," Marcus observed. "Dad told me she believed in signs and patterns." "Your father's mentioned her a few times in our conversations," Mitchell said, his tone careful. "Jessica, right? He seems to have loved her very much." "He still does," Marcus said simply. "There's a picture of her next to his bed. Sometimes I hear him talking to it late at night when he thinks I'm asleep." Mitchell's expression softened. "Losing someone you love leaves a mark that never fully fades. I lost my wife about 5 years ago, cancer." "I'm sorry," Marcus said, the words feeling inadequate. "Mom had cancer too. I was only 2 when she died, so I don't really remember her. Just feelings, I guess, the way she smelled, the sound of her laugh." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the ambient hum of the simulator's systems. Then Mitchell straightened, professional demeanor returning. "Let's continue with the checklist. Hydraulic systems are next." As they worked through the remaining items, Marcus couldn't help wondering about the materials Mitchell had mentioned. Grandpa Walter's flight log and notebooks, which Mitchell had promised to bring to their next session. He'd been curious about them since the text message at the airport, but each time they'd met, Mitchell had apologized for forgetting to bring them. "Captain Mitchell," Marcus began once they'd completed the checklist, "you mentioned having some of my grandfather's things." "Ah, yes," Mitchell looked genuinely chagrined. "They're still at my home. I keep meaning to bring them, but with the Houston route this week, it slipped my mind again." He checked his watch. "Tell you what, our simulator time is nearly up, but what if I drop them by your house this weekend? Sunday afternoon, perhaps?" Marcus brightened. "That would be great. Dad would love to see them too." "I'm sure he would," Mitchell agreed, though something in his tone suggested reservation. There's actually something I've been meaning to discuss with both of you. Sunday might be a good opportunity. Before Marcus could ask what he meant, the simulator technician knocked on the door, indicating their session was over. As they exited the mock cockpit, Mitchell placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture that had become familiar over their weeks of mentorship. "You did well today, son," Mitchell said. "Really well. You have a natural aptitude that can't be taught." That word, with the same easy affection as on their first meeting. Marcus had noticed how freely it flowed from Mitchell, how natural it seemed despite the relatively short time they'd known each other. It never failed to produce a warm feeling of acceptance, of belonging to something larger than himself. "Thanks, Captain," Marcus replied, unable to keep the pride from his voice, "for everything you're teaching me." Mitchell's expression grew serious. "There's something else I want to tell you, Marcus, something important." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "The day we met, when that gate agent made you wait outside, I want you to know I filed a formal complaint with Delta Management." Marcus blinked in surprise. "You did?" "What happened was wrong," Mitchell said firmly. "It wasn't a misunderstanding or a confusion about protocol. It was bias, plain and simple, and in my airline, in my profession, that's unacceptable." A complex emotion welled in Marcus's chest. Gratitude, certainly, but also a strange sort of relief. Throughout his life, these incidents had often been minimized or explained away, even by well-meaning adults. To hear Mitchell name it so directly felt like validation of something Marcus had always known but had rarely heard acknowledged. "Ms. Winters apologized," Marcus said, not sure why he felt compelled to offer this mitigation. "Good," Mitchell replied, "but apologies without accountability and systemic change don't prevent recurrence." He squeezed Marcus's shoulder gently. "In the cockpit, we have a concept called just culture, owning mistakes without shame, but with full responsibility so we can learn and improve. The same principle should apply everywhere else." As they walked toward the exit where James would be waiting to pick up Marcus, Mitchell added, "Aviation has not always been welcoming to everyone. That's changing, but not fast enough. Part of my responsibility as a senior captain is to accelerate that change, to make sure the sky is open to every qualified person who dreams of flying, regardless of what they look like or where they come from." They pushed through the glass doors to the parking area, where James was leaning against his Honda, watching their approach with a mixture of curiosity and caution that Marcus had come to recognize whenever his father saw him with Mitchell. "Mr. Washington," Mitchell called in greeting, extending his hand as they reached the car. "Your son continues to impress. The simulator instructor said he's never seen a first-timer handle the controls with such natural ability." James shook Mitchell's hand, his expression warming with pride as he glanced at Marcus. "He's always had good hands, built his first model airplane when he was 6, every piece perfectly aligned, not a drop of glue visible." "Like his mother," Mitchell said, the comment clearly intended as a compliment but landing with an unexpected weight that created a momentary awkwardness. James's smile faltered slightly. "Yes, Jessica was precise." Marcus looked between the two men, sensing again that undercurrent of unspoken history. "Captain Mitchell's going to come by the house on Sunday," he interjected, hoping to ease the tension. "He has Grandpa Walter's flight log to show us." "Sunday," James repeated, his gaze still on Mitchell. "What time were you thinking?" "Around 2, if that works for you both," Mitchell suggested. "There are some things we should discuss." Something in Mitchell's tone must have registered with James because his posture shifted subtly, becoming more alert. "What kind of things?" Mitchell glanced at Marcus, then back to James. "Family history, connections that I think you'll find significant." James's eyebrows drew together. "You've been mentioning connections since we met at the airport, Robert. What exactly are you getting at?" Mitchell seemed to make a decision. "I knew Jessica," he said quietly. James stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to Marcus's shoulder in a protective gesture that mirrored Mitchell's earlier touch. "You knew my wife? How? When?" "It's complicated," Mitchell replied, his eyes never leaving James's face. "And it's not a conversation for a parking lot, Sunday at 2. The tension between the two men was palpable now, and Marcus found himself holding his breath, waiting for his father's response. After what seemed like a long moment, James nodded once. Sunday at 2, our address is. I have it from the mentorship paperwork, Mitchell interrupted gently. I'll be there. He turned to Marcus with a smile that seemed forced around the edges. Keep reviewing those aerodynamics principles we discussed. I might quiz you on Sunday. Yes, sir, Marcus responded automatically, though his mind was now racing with questions about what Mitchell had just revealed. As they watched Mitchell walk to his car, James's hand remained firm on Marcus's shoulder, his grip perhaps tighter than he realized. Dad, Marcus ventured once Mitchell had driven away, did you know that Captain Mitchell knew Mom? James shook his head slowly, his expression unreadable. No, I had no idea. He opened the passenger door for Marcus, his movements mechanical. Let's go home. We have a lot to talk about before Sunday. The drive home was unusually quiet, James lost in thought as he navigated through Atlanta traffic. Marcus stared out the window, watching the city scroll by as his mind filled with possibilities. How had Mitchell known his mother? Why hadn't he mentioned it earlier? And what were these significant connections he wanted to discuss? When James finally broke the silence, they were nearly home, turning onto the oak-lined street of their subdivision. Marcus, I need you to understand something. Captain Mitchell has been generous with his time and knowledge, and I'm grateful for what he's teaching you. But we don't really know him or what his motivations might be. You think he's lying about knowing Mom? Marcus asked, confusion creeping into his voice. No, James said after a moment. I don't think he's lying, but people can have complicated reasons for inserting themselves into others' lives. He's not inserting himself, Marcus protested. He's mentoring me. He filed a complaint about what happened at the gate. He's helping me, Dad. James sighed as he pulled into their driveway. I know, son, and maybe that's all this is, a good man paying forward a debt he feels he owes to our family because of something my father did decades ago. But what? James turned off the engine but made no move to exit the car. But life has taught me to be cautious, especially when things seem too neat, too coincidental. He turned to face Marcus fully. Just keep an open mind on Sunday, okay? Don't get your hopes up too high about whatever Mitchell wants to share. The warning puzzled Marcus, but he nodded in agreement. Okay, Dad. As they entered the house, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something momentous was approaching. That Sunday's meeting would reveal truths that would reshape his understanding of his family, his history, and perhaps even his future. Whether those revelations would strengthen or damage the new bonds forming between the Washingtons and Captain Mitchell remained to be seen. But Marcus found himself both eager for and apprehensive about the answers that Sunday would bring. Sunday arrived with an unseasonable warmth that had James opening windows throughout the house, allowing a gentle breeze to circulate through rooms that had been closed up against winter's lingering chill. Marcus had been up since dawn, alternating between reviewing the aerodynamics textbook Mitchell had lent him and restlessly straightening the already tidy living room. He's not coming until 2, James reminded him, watching as Marcus adjusted the angle of a family photo for the 3rd time. And he's not here to inspect our housekeeping. I know, Marcus replied, stepping back to assess the photo, a Christmas portrait of himself and James from 2 years ago. I just want everything to be nice. James observed his son's nervous energy with a mixture of amusement and concern. Over the past weeks, he'd watched Marcus's admiration for Mitchell grow into something approaching hero worship, a natural enough dynamic in a mentoring relationship, but one that left James uneasy given the unfolding complications. Mitchell's revelation that he had known Jessica had been preoccupying James since Friday, his mind spinning through possibilities, none of them entirely comfortable. That Mitchell had been in the cockpit while Jessica worked as a flight attendant seemed the most probable connection. Jessica had flown for Delta for nearly 4 years before her diagnosis had grounded her permanently. It was entirely plausible that she and Mitchell had crewed the same flights, perhaps even regularly if their schedules had aligned. But if that were the case, why hadn't Mitchell mentioned it immediately upon learning her name? And what made this connection significant enough to warrant a special meeting? James's architectural training had taught him to consider structures holistically, to examine how each element related to the whole, how seemingly separate components interacted to create stability or tension. Applying this perspective to the situation with Mitchell yielded troubling questions. Was it truly coincidence that the pilot who had once offered James help had reappeared in Marcus's life? Was Mitchell's interest in mentoring Marcus genuinely about nurturing talent, or was there some other agenda at play? The doorbell's chime jolted James from his thoughts. He checked his watch. 1:42 p.m. Mitchell was early. "He's here," Marcus exclaimed, abandoning all pretense of calm as he hurried toward the front door. He paused with his hand on the knob, taking a deep breath before opening it with a carefully modulated, "Good afternoon, Captain Mitchell." Mitchell stood on the porch, casually dressed in khakis and a light blue button-down that was a shade darker than his pilot's uniform shirt. He carried a weathered leather portfolio under one arm and held a small gift bag in his opposite hand. "Marcus, James," he greeted them with a nod. "I hope I'm not too early. Traffic was lighter than I expected." "Not at all," James replied, stepping forward to shake Mitchell's hand. "Please come in." As Mitchell crossed the threshold, James noticed his gaze sweeping the entryway and living room with quiet assessment. Noting the framed architectural drawings on one wall, James's work, the model airplanes displayed on floating shelves, Marcus's handiwork, and the collection of family photos arranged on the fireplace mantel. His eyes lingered briefly on a portrait of Jessica, her smile radiant against a background of autumn leaves, before he turned his attention back to his hosts. "You have a lovely home," Mitchell offered, the compliment seeming genuine despite its conventionality. "Thank you," James responded, gesturing toward the sofa. "Can I get you something to drink? Water, coffee, tea?" "Water would be fine, thanks." As James moved toward the kitchen, he heard Marcus launching immediately into questions about their last simulator session. By the time he returned with 3 glasses of water, Marcus and Mitchell were already deep in conversation about the relative merits of Boeing versus Airbus control systems. The portfolio and gift bag set aside on the coffee table, momentarily forgotten. James placed the glasses on coasters and settled into an armchair across from them, allowing the technical discussion to continue for a few minutes before gently clearing his throat. "I believe you mentioned having some materials that belong to my father, Robert." Mitchell straightened, his expression shifting from relaxed engagement to something more serious. "Yes, of course." He reached for the leather portfolio. "These have been in my possession for many years. I should have found a way to return them to your family sooner." As Mitchell carefully opened the portfolio, James felt a strange tightening in his chest. The idea of seeing something that had once belonged to Walter Washington, something James hadn't known existed, filled him with a complex mixture of anticipation and unease. Mitchell removed several items and placed them on the coffee table with careful reverence. A dog-eared logbook bound in faded blue canvas, 3 spiral notebooks filled with cramped handwriting, and a small envelope of photographs. "Your father was briefly enrolled in the Air Force's pilot training program in 1962, Mitchell explained, directing his words to James, but including Marcus with occasional glances. "These are his flight logs from that period, along with his technical notes and some photographs from his training days." James stared at the items, momentarily speechless. "My father was training to be a pilot," he finally managed. "He never mentioned that, not once in all the stories he told about his service." Mitchell nodded as if he'd expected this reaction. It was a complicated time. The Air Force had technically been desegregated since 1948, but in practice, Black airmen faced significant barriers, especially in prestigious roles like pilot positions. "He told me he chose to be a mechanic because he loved working with his hands," James said quietly, reaching for the logbook with hesitant fingers. "He said flying was too solitary, that he preferred being part of a ground crew." "That may have been partially true," Mitchell acknowledged. "But it wasn't the whole story. Walter was selected for pilot training, one of very few black candidates at the time, but was reassigned to mechanical duties after approximately 6 months of flight instruction." James opened the logbook carefully, as if it might disintegrate under his touch. The first page bore his father's name in neat block letters, WALTER James Washington. Below that, a service number and the date, January 15, 1962. "Why was he reassigned?" Marcus asked, leaning forward to see the logbook in his father's hands. Mitchell's expression grew more somber. The official record cites performance issues during instrument training, but your grandfather's actual flight records, he gestured to the open logbook, tell a different story. His evaluations were consistently above average, sometimes excellent. There were no legitimate performance issues. Then why? James began, though he already suspected the answer. It was 1962, Mitchell said simply. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. There was resistance in many institutions, including the military, to full integration and equal opportunity. James carefully turned the pages of the logbook, noting his father's meticulous documentation of each training flight, hours, maneuvers practiced, instructor comments. He never said a word about this, not one word. Many men of his generation didn't, Mitchell observed. They absorbed the injustices and moved forward, focusing on what they could control rather than what they couldn't. Marcus reached for one of the spiral notebooks, opening it to reveal pages of technical notes interspersed with detailed drawings of aircraft components. Grandpa drew these? They're amazing. Your grandfather had an exceptional understanding of aircraft systems, Mitchell confirmed. Which is why, despite the disappointment of being removed from pilot training, he became one of the most respected mechanics at several Air Force bases throughout his career. James glanced up from the logbook, a new question forming. How did you come to have these items? You mentioned finding them at Dobbins, but my father was stationed at several bases throughout his career. He wasn't at Dobbins until the late 80s, long after his training days. Mitchell nodded, as if approving James's astute observation. That's correct. These items weren't Walter's personal copies. They're the official training records that were kept in Air Force files. When bases consolidated certain administrative functions in the early 90s, old personnel files were being sorted for archiving or disposal. I was a young captain then, serving as a liaison officer for a joint training program. I happened to be present when a clerk was processing files from the 1960s, and I noticed your father's name. You recognized his name? James asked, his suspicion evident. How? You told me you'd known him at Dobbins, but not during his early career. Mitchell shifted slightly, his posture straightening as if preparing to navigate difficult terrain. I recognized the name Washington because it had been mentioned to me before, by someone who knew your father's story and who felt it held important lessons about persistence and dignity in the face of injustice. Who mentioned it to you? James pressed. Mitchell reached for the small gift bag he'd brought, withdrawing a framed photograph that he placed carefully on the coffee table, facing James and Marcus. Jessica, your wife, Marcus's mother. The photograph showed a much younger Mitchell in a pilot's uniform, arm in arm with an equally young Jessica in a flight attendant's uniform, both smiling broadly against the backdrop of an airport terminal. The casual intimacy of their posture suggested a relationship beyond mere colleagues. James felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. He stared at the photograph, unable to reconcile the image with his understanding of his wife's life before they'd met. I don't understand, he said finally, his voice barely audible. Marcus looked from the photograph to his father's pale face, then to Mitchell's solemn expression. You and my mom were friends? He asked, reaching for the frame with trembling fingers. We were more than friends for a time, Mitchell said gently. Jessica and I were engaged before she met your father. The statement landed in the room like a physical blow. James found himself gripping the arms of his chair, anchoring himself against a wave of disorientation. That's not possible, he said, shaking his head. Jessica would have told me if she'd been engaged before. It was brief, Mitchell explained, his tone careful, respectful. We met when she first started flying for Delta in 1987. I was a recently divorced first officer then. We dated for about a year and were engaged for 4 months before we separated in late 1988. James's mind raced through calculations. He'd met Jessica in January 1989, their whirlwind romance culminating in marriage by that summer. Had she been fresh from a broken engagement? How had she never mentioned this? Why did you separate? Marcus asked, still holding the photograph, studying the young faces of his mother and the man who was now his mentor. Mitchell glanced at James, as if seeking permission to continue. When James gave a slight nod, still too stunned to speak, Mitchell continued softly. We wanted different things. Jessica wanted children, a family. I was focused on my career, on making captain as quickly as possible. I wasn't ready for the life she envisioned. A shadow of regret crossed his features. It was the biggest mistake of my life, letting her go. By the time I realized that she had met your father and was happier than I'd ever seen her. James found his voice at last. You knew she was with me. Mitchell nodded. We still worked together occasionally on the same flight crews. She told me about you, how you were studying architecture, how you made her laugh, how you valued family the way she did. He smiled faintly. She was radiant when she talked about you, James. There was never any doubt she'd made the right choice. A heavy silence filled the room as James absorbed this information, this previously unknown chapter of Jessica's life suddenly revealing itself after all these years. His eyes returned to the logbook in his lap, his father's hidden history, then to the photograph of Jessica and Mitchell, her hidden history. So many secrets carried by the people he'd thought he knew completely. That night in the rain, James said slowly, connecting pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed until now. When we nearly crashed on Highway 41, you recognized my name when I told you who I was. Yes, Mitchell admitted. I knew immediately you were Jessica's James, and when you mentioned your father had been in the Air Force, had wanted to be a pilot but had become a mechanic instead, I knew you were Walter Washington's son as well. That's why you offered to help me with flight training, James realized. Not just because of what my father did for you, but because of Jessica. Both reasons were true, Mitchell said. Your father's story had affected me deeply when Jessica shared it. It was one of the reasons I began working on diversity initiatives within Delta, trying to ensure that talented people weren't overlooked or held back because of their race or background. He paused. And yes, I wanted to help you because you were important to Jessica, but I never told her about our encounter. Why not? James demanded, an edge entering his voice. Because it was your story to tell, not mine, Mitchell replied simply. I gave you my card. The choice to follow up was yours. Another silence descended, heavier than before. Marcus looked between the two men, clearly trying to absorb the implications of everything being revealed. There's more, isn't there? James finally asked, intuition telling him they hadn't yet reached the core of what Mitchell had come to share. Mitchell nodded, his expression grave. Yes, there's more, and this is the part I've struggled most with how to tell you. He reached into the portfolio again and withdrew a sealed envelope, handling it with particular care. After Jessica's diagnosis, when the treatments weren't working, she contacted me. James flinched visibly. The period of Jessica's illness had been the darkest time of his life. Watching her fade while trying to care for an infant Marcus, the mounting medical bills, the desperate search for experimental treatments when conventional approaches failed. She wrote me a letter, Mitchell continued quietly, asked me to check in on you and Marcus if, when, she was gone. He extended the envelope toward James. She wrote this for you to be delivered if I ever became part of your lives again. She had a sense that might happen someday. James stared at the envelope, Jessica's familiar handwriting addressing it simply to James. For a moment, he couldn't bring himself to take it, as if accepting this letter from beyond would somehow disturb the careful equilibrium he'd established in the years since her death. Dad, Marcus's voice was soft, uncertain. The concern in his son's tone broke through James's paralysis. He reached for the envelope, taking it from Mitchell's outstretched hand. I'll give you privacy to read it, Mitchell offered, beginning to rise. No, James said firmly. Stay. Whatever Jessica wanted to say, I think we should all hear it. He looked at Marcus. Together. With careful fingers, James broke the seal on the envelope and withdrew 2 pages of Jessica's distinctive stationery, pale blue paper she'd always used for important correspondence. Her handwriting, normally so precise, showed slight tremors that evidenced the physical toll of her illness. James cleared his throat and began to read aloud. My dearest James, asterisk. If you're reading this, 2 things have happened. I am gone, and Robert Mitchell has somehow found his way back into our family's orbit. Neither of these things surprises me. Death has been circling me for months now, and as for Robert, well, I've always believed that some connections are meant to complete themselves, even if the pattern takes years to reveal itself. There are things I never told you, partly because they seemed irrelevant to the joy we found together, and partly because I was afraid they might hurt you unnecessarily. But now I believe you should know the full circle of our story. Before I met you, I was briefly engaged to Robert. It ended because we wanted different lives at different times. There were no villains in our separation, just two people who weren't meant to walk the same path. Meeting you confirmed that for me 1,000 times over. What I never told you was that Robert and I remained casual friends after our relationship ended. Not close, but friendly when our flight schedules crossed. It was during one of those chance encounters that I first heard about you, months before we actually met. Robert told me about a rainy night when he nearly collided with a grieving young man who had just buried his father. He told me how that young man, you, James, spoke about flight and family legacy and dreams deferred with such passion that it had affected him deeply. He mentioned that he had offered to help you with flight training, had given you his card. When I met you in Professor Abernathy's physics class the following semester, I recognized your name immediately. I'd been curious about the young man from Robert's story, wondering if you'd ever called him to accept his offer. Our meeting felt like fate, a connection that had begun forming before we ever laid eyes on each other. I didn't tell you then because it seemed too strange, too coincidental. And later, when we fell in love, it didn't matter anymore. Our story was our own, regardless of how it began. But now, as I face the reality that I won't be there to see Marcus grow up, I find myself returning to thoughts of connection and purpose. I believe Robert may re-enter your lives someday. His offer to help you pursue flying wasn't only about paying forward the debt he felt to your father. It was also about recognizing something kindred in you, the same passion for flight that drew him to the sky, the same integrity that made your father an exceptional airman despite the barriers placed before him. If Robert does find his way back to you and Marcus, please consider that perhaps this completion of the circle is meant to be. Perhaps the mentorship he once offered you might now benefit our son. James, you've been the love of my life, the perfect partner in every way that matters. I have no regrets about the path that led me to you, only gratitude for the journey we've shared and sorrow that it must end too soon. All my love, always and forever, *. Jessica. James lowered the letter, his vision blurred with tears he hadn't realized were falling. Beside him, Marcus was openly crying, one hand covering his mouth as if to physically contain his emotion. Mitchell sat motionless, his own eyes glistening, respectfully silent as the Washingtons processed Jessica's words from across the years. She knew, James finally said, his voice rough with emotion. Somehow she knew you would find your way to Marcus. Mitchell nodded slowly. Jessica had an intuition about connections that I never understood but learned not to dismiss. He hesitated before continuing. When I saw Marcus's name on the career day roster, when I realized he was your son, her son, I felt. I can only describe it as a circuit completing. Jessica would have called it destiny. Marcus looked up from the letter to Mitchell's face, studying it with new understanding. All these weeks you've been helping me. Was it just because of Mom, because you felt obligated? No, Mitchell answered without hesitation. I began because of that connection, yes, but I've continued because you, Marcus Washington, have genuine talent and passion for aviation. The sky belongs to you if you want it, regardless of any past connections between our families. James carefully refolded Jessica's letter, his thoughts a tumult of revelations and realignments. The narrative of his life, of his family, had just been rewritten in ways he was still struggling to comprehend. Walter Washington's thwarted pilot dreams, Jessica's previous engagement to Robert Mitchell, the thread of flight and fate that seemed to weave through generations of Washingtons, culminating now in Marcus. I don't know what to say, James admitted finally, looking between Mitchell and his son. This is overwhelming. I understand, Mitchell said, rising from his seat. I should go give you both space to process everything. I apologize if bringing this to you now was wrong, but... No, James interrupted, standing as well. No, I think Jessica was right, about connections completing themselves, about circles closing. He extended his hand to Mitchell. Thank you for bringing my father's records home, and for Jessica's letter, and most of all, thank you for what you're doing for Marcus. Mitchell took the offered hand, his grip firm and steady. Your family has been intertwined with mine for longer than any of us realized. I'd be honored to continue being part of Marcus's journey with your blessing. James nodded, a sense of rightness gradually replacing his initial disorientation. You have it. Marcus stood too, wiping away tears with the back of his hand. Does this mean we're still doing the simulator sessions? The question, so practical amidst the emotional weight of the moment, startled a laugh from both men. Absolutely, Mitchell confirmed, smiling. In fact, I've been speaking with some colleagues at Delta about a potential scholarship program for exceptional students interested in aviation careers from underrepresented backgrounds. If you're interested, I'd like to nominate you as our first candidate. Marcus's eyes widened. A scholarship for pilot training. For college first, aviation science or aerospace engineering, then flight school, Mitchell explained. It's still in development, but the funding is secure. James placed a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the tension and excitement vibrating through him. That sounds like an extraordinary opportunity if Marcus is interested. Interested? Marcus exclaimed. Dad, it's everything I've been working toward. As Mitchell prepared to leave, promising to send details about the scholarship program and to continue their regular mentoring sessions, James found himself standing before the mantel, looking at the photographs displayed there. Jessica's radiant smile, Walter's dignified stance in his Air Force uniform, his own younger self arm around a pregnant Jessica, both beaming with anticipation of the life they were creating together. And now Marcus, poised to fulfill a legacy that stretched back generations. A dream of flight that had been deferred but never abandoned, passing from grandfather to son, waiting for the right moment, the right constellation of circumstances to finally take wing. She would be so proud of him, Mitchell said quietly, coming to stand beside James. Yes, James agreed, watching as Marcus carefully collected Walter's flight logs and technical notebooks, already engrossed in this newfound connection to his grandfather. Of all of us, I think. As Mitchell departed and father and son settled in to explore Walter Washington's meticulously documented journey through flight training, James felt something shift within him, a recognition that the past was not static but living, continuously informing and shaping the present in ways both visible and hidden. The story of his family, he now understood, was far more complex and interconnected than he had ever imagined. And somewhere, he was certain, Jessica was smiling at the perfect symmetry of it all. 6 months later, Marcus Washington stood on the tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, the same place where his journey with Captain Mitchell had begun. But today was different. Today, he wore a crisp white shirt with the Delta emblem, the uniform of the airline's prestigious youth aviation program, which had accepted him as its youngest participant following Mitchell's recommendation and Marcus's exceptional entrance examination results. Beside him stood his father, pride evident in every line of his face as he watched Mitchell's Boeing 737 taxi toward them. And on Marcus's other side stood Ms. Winters, the gate agent whose bias had nearly derailed his first meeting with Mitchell. She was here not by coincidence, but by design, part of Delta's new staff education program that paired employees with promising young aviation students from diverse backgrounds. Nervous? James asked, noting his son's tightly clasped hands. Marcus shook his head, a smile breaking across his features. Not nervous, ready. As Captain Mitchell's plane came to a stop and the boarding stairs were positioned, Ms. Winters leaned slightly toward Marcus. I wanted to tell you again how sorry I am about what happened that day, she said, her voice sincere, and how grateful I am for this opportunity to learn and do better. The past is just the beginning of the story, Marcus replied, unconsciously echoing words his mother had written to his father years before. It's what happens next that matters. The door of the aircraft opened, and Captain Mitchell emerged, raising a hand in greeting when he spotted the small group waiting for him. As he descended the stairs, his captain's stripes gleaming in the Georgia sunshine, Marcus felt the weight of history and possibility resting equally on his shoulders. Walter Washington's deferred dreams, James Washington's protective love, Jessica Washington's intuitive faith in connections yet to form, and his own nascent journey toward the sky. Ready for your first flight deck observation, Mr. Washington, Mitchell called as he approached. Marcus straightened, feeling the perfect alignment of past, present, and future in this moment. Yes, sir, I've been ready my whole life. And as they walked toward the terminal together, pilot and protege, father and son, the gatekeepers of yesterday and the pioneers of tomorrow. The contrails of distant aircraft etched temporary pathways across the endless blue above them, reminding all who looked up that the sky had never belonged to one kind of person, but to all who possessed the courage to claim it.